In 1842, Karl Marx, at age 24, observed something terrible happening in the forests of Rhineland. The peasants, who had been used to gathering fallen wood from the forests, were being beaten and arrested by the police. A new law had been passed which said that the forest produce, which by custom had been available to anyone, was now the private property of the forest owners. The people see the punishment, Marx wrote, but they do not see the crime. It was clear that they were being arrested, they were being beaten. That was the punishment. But what was the crime? This was not clear to the peasantry. 3 years later, in 1845, Marx's friend Friedrich Engels published The Condition of the Working Class in England, a remarkable book in which Engels described a hell on earth. The industrial workers, Engels showed, faced a social war from the bourgeoisie. Women made unfit for childbearing, children deformed, men enfeebled, limbs crushed, whole generations wrecked, afflicted with disease and infirmity, purely to fill the purses of the bourgeoisie, wrote Engels of Manchester, the city where he lived. You didn't have to be a communist, as Engels would become, to be outraged by what you saw. The same year as Engels published The Condition of the Working Class in England, Benjamin Disraeli, who would later become a conservative Prime Minister of Britain, published Sybil, or Two Nations. The two nations referred to in the title are not two countries, but the two nations within Britain, the nation of the bourgeoisie, to borrow Engels' vocabulary, and the nation of the proletariat. There was great social disparity and class war. Both Engels, the young communist, and Disraeli, the young conservative, saw the same thing, as did the novelist Charles Dickens, whose novel Hard Times, published in 1854, described the terrors of life in the shadows of the large factories, as did Elizabeth Gaskell in her 1855 novel North and South. Both Dickens and Gaskell based their novels on Manchester. Their protagonists, Stephen Blackpool for Dickens and Margaret Hale for Gaskell, each give of their labor and are ruined by it. Each of these sensitive writers was shocked by the great violence done to the communities of workers, working long hours, brutalized by the speed of factory production, inhaling the dust of cotton and cold, incapable of building lives, but reduced now to labor, hands as they were known. Inequality was a problem, surely. Only the most hard-hearted soul didn't see that. A generation before Engels, Disraeli, Dickens, and Gaskell, the political economist David Ricardo, in his On the Principles of Political Economy and Taxation, published in 1817, saw the problem as well. But the problem for people like Ricardo and for liberals of all kinds is that the wealth produced in society is not adequately distributed. The solution to the vast problems in society lay at the level of distribution. Taxation would take some of the resources from the wealthy and divert them to the poor. Of course, the problem was that there was a great divergence between the resources held by the wealthy and those held by the poor. After all, the very descriptions of wealthy and poor were derived from the differences of control of resources. But according to Karl Marx, Ricardo and others like him had not asked the fundamental question: why do some people have so much wealth and others have so little? Why, in other words, is it a crime to collect fallen wood in the Rhine forests? It is a crime because the peasants take firewood which has been declared to be private property. The fallen wood is no longer the common property of people. Old customary practices were set aside by the rigorous implementation of the bourgeois legal order. The liberals saw the problem, the poverty of the people, even the violence against hard-working people who were merely trying to survive. But what they didn't understand is why the people were poor and why there was this violence, both violence that is visible, such as the police beating the poor, and the violence that is structural, such as the starvation that had become widespread amongst the poor. At the close of chapter 6 of Capital, Volume 1, Marx says that to understand the reason why the world is in such a sorry state, we must leave the realm of distribution and enter the realm of production. Let us, in company with the owner of money and the owner of labor power, leave this noisy sphere where everything takes place on the surface and in the full view of everyone, and follow them into the hidden abode of production, on whose threshold there hangs the notice, "No admittance except on business." Here we shall see not only how capital produces, but how capital is itself produced. The secret of profit making must at last be laid bare. On the surface exist words like freedom and equality, but beneath them lies the mystery of the extraction of surplus value, the creation of profit, and the accumulation of capital. It is here that we can understand why social inequality is reproduced and hardened. It is here that Marx reveals the secret of capitalist accumulation. The workers, dispossessed from the means of production, have no way to survive without selling their labor to the capitalist. The capitalist who owns the means of production now uses the labor power to produce an endless array of commodities which are sold for profit. The profit comes not because of trade, buying low and selling high, but from the extraction of surplus value in the production process. Social production, enhanced by the immense power of science and technology, generates an enormous number of commodities and of social wealth. What prevents the workers from accessing the very social wealth that they produce is the social fact of private property. There are enough goods to fulfill the needs of people, but the people cannot access these goods because they do not have money. They do not have access to the fruits of private property. Their punishment is that they must starve or be arrested for theft if they go to pick wood or seize food. Their crime is that they violate private property. Their sole mission is to sell their labor power, their main commodity, so it can be exploited by the capitalists to accumulate. For this accumulation is for the capitalist a religion. It is their Moses and the prophets, as Marx writes in chapter 24 of Capital, Volume 1. The German philosopher G.W.F. Hegel, who taught Marx a great deal, believed that world history is progress in consciousness, or that the development of human freedom defines the history of the world. The fight for freedom led by people is enough to drive humanity toward emancipation. That was Hegel's view. For Marx and Engels, the emphasis on emancipation was exhilarating but limited. Certain people, in different ways, fought to emancipate themselves from various forms of bondage. But a review of these struggles themselves would not be enough to both understand the dynamic of history and to understand the possibility of emancipation. Historical development takes place under particular historically specific conditions. Based on the state of material conditions, human beings enter into definitive relations with each other to form definitive social relations. In a time of scarcity, for instance, there is a greater likelihood of bondage, with the relations between people mediated through or shaped by the lack of material goods. The massive production of goods at an industrial scale allowed Marx to imagine the possibility for the movement of human beings from the realm of necessity to the realm of freedom, namely socialism. This was not freedom in idealistic terms, but freedom as total human emancipation, which means freedom in both idealist and materialist terms. Competition between capitals and between capital and labor resulted in the transformation of productive forces, namely better technology and a better organization of production. This development of productive forces intensifies pressure on the social relations of production, which sharpens the conflict between classes. These contradictions, sharpened by the struggle between classes, drives history forward in a zigzag way, not always in a progressive direction, as Engels wrote in his note on Marx's preface to the 1859 Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy. In that preface, Marx attempts to explain this dialectical relationship between the productive forces, namely technology and the organization of production, and the social relations of production, namely the way in which humans relate to each other, either through hierarchies of status or class. Turning against Hegel's idealism, Marx writes sharply, "It is not the consciousness of men that determines their existence, but their social existence that determines their consciousness." He doesn't mean that humans can sit passively by while technology drives history forward. He means that the struggle between the productive forces, which are themselves shaped by human beings, and the organization of society into classes, which are again shaped by human beings, will drive history forward. He means that the combination of the productive forces and the social relations, their social existence, rather than merely their consciousness, is the motor of history. Tantalizingly, in the preface, Marx writes that we are as yet only in the prehistory of humanity. Till now, he writes, there have been a series of phases in human existence, Asiatic, ancient feudal, and modern bourgeois. And each of these phases is founded on the antagonistic form of the social process of production. It is important to note that this is a sketch of a series of social formations and not a comprehensive list of stages. Marx laid out 3 phases in order to emphasize the contingent nature of human existence, the vast changes that had already come in history, and the changes that lay before us. Beyond the capitalist form lies another form of history, where social antagonism is overcome by the social organization of production. This is the form of history which Marx and Engels called communism. There are several important points to be made from this theory of history, which goes by the name of historical materialism. First, that human is not an eternal concept. Marx is very cautious about the use of categories. Words such as money or human appear to be timeless and transhistorical, when in fact they have a different meaning in different historical epochs. In his 6th thesis on Feuerbach, Marx writes, "Human nature is not an abstraction dwelling within the single individual. Its reality is the sum total of social relations. Where the enslavement of humans existed, such as in the ancient world, to speak of human did not mean to speak of all people universally. Human as a concept only described certain people. It took great struggles to emancipate people from slavery and to redefine the term human to refer to humans universally. Related to this is human nature. The apostles of capitalism argued that the system was founded on greed, which is an essential emotion of human nature. The entire system of neoclassical economics the demand and supply curve, for instance, is premised on greed. Each party seeks the best deal possible, all things remaining the same. But every transaction between humans cannot be reduced to greed, since humans are complex and our nature is historical and contextual. At times, love dominates human interactions, and at other times, fear or uncertainty. Greed is only one of a complex set of emotions, and what we understand as greed now was not something that was universal in earlier times, when certain people were not permitted to be governed by greed. Secondly, that the main social formation is not eternal. The list of phases that Marx provides from Asiatic to modern bourgeois suggests that human history is not static, nor is it informed by transcendental and titanic conflicts such as between freedom and unfreedom. Marx takes the great historical challenges identified by Hegel, the hunger for freedom, for instance, and grounds them in this actual historical processes that are shaped by material and idealist forces, from the ability of people to generate sufficient social surpluses and the ability of people to imagine themselves beyond the restraints of a class society. Capitalism, for instance, is not a permanent condition whose roots can be sought in the ancient world and then drawn into greater and greater forms of complexity outward into the future. Instead, Marx argued that capitalism was merely one more social formation in a long process of social development that includes pre-capitalist societies that had been organized in ways that would be utterly alien to a capitalist society. If pre-capitalism was so very different from capitalism, then capitalism is not eternal and it can also be superseded. Third, that capitalism has advanced sufficiently to indicate a possible socialist future. In the German ideology, Marx and Engels wrote that a future society, a communist society, is not a state of affairs which is established, an ideal to which reality must adjust itself. We call communism the real movement which abolishes the present state of things. The condition of this movement result from the premises now in existence. Capitalism has advanced sufficiently with the socialization of labor, both increasing the material wealth of society, which in turn could be socialized to provide the material and spiritual wealth of each and every person. In their writings from the 1840s to the 1860s, Marx and Engels indicated pathways to a socialist transition out of the calamities of capitalism. Here are some examples of the future already visible 180 years ago. A. If the means of production are socially owned, then production could be administered and developed in a planned fashion by the producers themselves. B. If material production is rationally organized, then shortages of essentials would be eliminated. C. If technology and productivity advance, then education levels would rise and the gap between mental and manual labor would lessen. Each of these pathways are not utopian, but fully visible in our present time. But they are blocked by the hierarchies of privilege, property, and power. There is no necessity that the development of the productive forces would drive the proletariat toward a social revolution. There are objective possibilities rather than necessity for a social transformation. The responsibility for that transformation is not left to abstractions such as history or the productive forces, but to the actions of the working class itself. In the preface to the 1859 Contribution, Marx had sketched out his views on the contradiction between the productive forces and the social relations of production. 8 years later, tucked into the center of capital, in chapter 32, Marx returns to the key contradiction that he had identified. Here, in one paragraph, Marx summarizes the concrete features of the development of capitalism that hastened the objective possibility of its transition to communism. The logic of capitalism tends, he wrote, towards centralization of capital, and he noted its necessary developments. A. On an ever-extending scale, the cooperative form of the labor process. B. The conscious technical application of science, including the methodical cultivation of the soil. C. The transformation of the instruments of labor into instruments of labor only usable in common. The economizing of all means of production by their use as means of production of combined socialized labor. Each of these elements, cooperatives, better use of science, including agronomy, and the socialization of production, open the way towards social production for social benefit, namely for communism. But a barrier exists. The monopoly of capital becomes a fetter upon the mode of production, Marx writes. This monopoly of capital, the power of capital, the power that private property gives to some people through their money power and their control of the state, prevents an easy transformation of the system. It is this monopoly of capital that blocks the transition. Behind the barrier of the monopoly of capital lie other significant impediments. In the 1859 preface, Marx wrote that the material transformation of the economic conditions of production can be determined with the precision of natural science. For instance, looking at the list in chapter 32, we can measure the centralization of capital, the socialization of labor, the enhanced productivity due to the conscious application of science, and so on. The objective conditions for an advance to socialism exist due to the real movement of social development. The ripening of the objective conditions for a transformation meet their fetters, namely the monopoly of capital. Then begins, Marx writes in 1859, an era of social revolution. It is, he points out, in the legal, political, religious, artistic, or philosophic, in short, the ideological forms in which men become conscious of this conflict and fight it out. Marxists recognize that in the cultural and social worlds, the battle of ideas is fought over the process of transformation. When the Russian Revolution took place against the Tsarist Empire, the Italian Marxist and communist leader Antonio Gramsci called it a revolution against capital. By capital, Gramsci meant the book by Marx and not Capital or Capitalism. Gramsci reflected on the general tenor in Marx's work as laid out in the preface, that no social order is ever destroyed before all the productive forces for which it is sufficient have been developed. So then, why was there a revolution against capitalism and towards socialism in a backward place such as the Tsarist Empire? Marxist after Marx, with Lenin at the heart of it, made the argument that in the colonized parts of the world, the advances of capitalism are blocked by imperialism. There is no possibility of a development towards fuller capitalism in the colonies. There is no need to wait for the productive forces to develop because they simply will not develop. Reading Capital from the parts of the world which have been maldeveloped by imperialism requires scrupulous attention to the fact that the productive forces are not fully developed and will never be fully developed. It requires the supplement from Lenin that the revolutions could take place in the weakest link of the imperialist chain, and then the responsibility for enhancing the productive forces rests with the socialists. It requires study about how the socialists must enhance the productive forces without unleashing the full animal spirits of capitalist deprivation. These are questions about the real movement of history and not the ideal to which reality must adjust itself. It is important to reflect on Marx's 1871 letter to Kugelmann, where he wrote, "World history would indeed be very easy to make if the struggle were taken up only when conditions were infallibly favorable. Struggles must continue. Opportunities must be taken. We must be prepared to win even when matters are not always propitious." But alongside this acknowledgement, made by Marx in 1871 and lived by the Bolsheviks in 1917, the Mongolians in 1919, the Vietnamese in 1945, the Chinese in 1949, the Cubans in 1959, and others, having made that acknowledgement, we have to recognize the science of historical materialism and the great contradictions on the road to the creation of a genuine humanity. We read Marx's Capital to understand not only the mechanisms by which surplus value is extracted, but also the class struggle by which the system might be overcome. You will learn a lot from Capital. Use it well. Either use it to learn its lessons and to sharpen your thinking, or just use it as a brick to throw at a bank.